as all of this has unfolded against the backdrop of what you and I and Erika have been watching over the course of the last 3 hours, which was that hearing for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was selected by President Trump to lead HHS, the nation's health agencies. And as expected, he faced some questions specifically from Democrats on his, for example, and from some Republicans on his position on abortion, on his position on vaccines, on a variety of controversial statements that he has made in the past, Ryan. The question now is, did any Republican, and I'm specifically asking about Republican senators, heard, do anything to change their position or to get them to potentially vote against President Trump on this nominee?
You know, Hallie, I think this was a bit of a rocky performance by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I think that some of these issues that he would potentially have given concerns to some of these Republican senators, I don't know if he necessarily articulated them in a way that would make them feel 100% comfortable. He equivocated on a lot of his positions as it relates to vaccines. He did not offer clarity on many of the issues that they may be concerned about. And I thought the most important questioning that took place may not be something that's going to resonate on social media channels because it wasn't that fiery, but it was a very quiet back and forth between Kennedy and Bill Cassidy, who is the member of Congress from Louisiana, a Republican, a doctor himself, someone who cares deeply about the administration of these programs. And Cassidy seemed to be asking Kennedy some very basic questions about the way these programs are operated and the way that they're administered. And Kennedy didn't seem to have the answers for how he would handle some of these very basic questions about Medicaid and Medicare and some of these other programs that would fall underneath his banner. You have to wonder if that sits in the back of Cassidy's mind as he labors over whether or not he wants to give Donald Trump this controversial pick to head up such an important agency. Now, we asked Cassidy about this after the hearing. We pressed him on his thoughts about Kennedy's vaccine status. He did not want to talk about it. So he's not coming out after this hearing saying affirmatively, I'm voting yes. Yeah. There's still, of course, another round of hearing to take place. But I do think if for some reason this nomination falls apart, which I don't think it's going to at this point, but if it does, I think we'll look back on that questioning as being very instructive of where it went off the rails.
Ryan, stand by for a moment. Let me bring in our NBC News medical reporter, Erika Edwards, who is joining us as well. To Ryan's point, some of that line of questioning, not just from Cassidy, but from others related to, let's say, specifically Medicaid, brought up some questions in the eyes of some on the grasp that Kennedy had of some of the really granular workings of that. He also sought to defend himself on his vaccine position, on his abortion position, and more. What stood out to you, and what are you hearing from sources about where this goes?
Yeah, there wasn't really a lot of meat, a lot of really clear talking points when Mr. Kennedy was pressed. One of the things that I was actually looking for was Senator Cassidy to ask, to really push Mr. Kennedy on his views on vaccines. As Ryan mentioned, Senator Cassidy is a gastroenterologist. He's a doctor. He has a long proven record of promoting vaccines and funding vaccine research. The other thing that really stuck out to me is that if confirmed, Mr. Kennedy, of course, would be over all of the major federal health agencies, CDC, NIH, et cetera. But the other group that really he has power over are the influential Maha moms, right? He gave them a lot of attention during his opening statement, calling them, one of the most powerful and transcendent groups he's ever seen, giving them credit, in his words, for propelling certain issues to the center stage, specifically the issue of childhood vaccines, which have shown time and time again to be safe and effective and certainly studied. And, but this is a group of these Maha moms. This is a group of people who are increasingly openly questioning vaccines, reaching out to other moms and other parents on social media in search of pediatricians, for example, who don't require their kids to get their shots. I've been reading a lot of these posts from the Maha moms. What's interesting is that they all encourage each other to do their research and to look at the science. But their science, it's sort of, we're going back to that idea of alternative facts, right? Their science may have flaws in it. And one of the vaccine experts that I've talked to said that, their bottom line concern is that Kennedy is going to give the American public what he sees as the version of the truth. They fear it's not going to be the scientifically supported truth. Hallie?
Erika Edwards, thank you so much. Ryan, in the minute we have left, let me go back to you because we are also looking ahead to some other potentially controversial confirmation hearings tomorrow for both Kash Patel, picked to lead the FBI, as well as Tulsi Gabbard, selected to lead the nation's intelligence agencies as well.
That's right. And we do expect some really tough questions for both of these individuals about their backgrounds, about some of the past controversial statements they've made, and Tulsi Gabbard's circumstance, some of the meetings that she's held with foreign leaders and the way that she has presented herself in terms of a lot of different foreign policy issues. Kash Patel, of course, wrote a very controversial book about his thoughts about what needed to be overhauled in the federal justice system. You can bet all of those things are going to be vetted during this hearing tomorrow.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.